All right, we're live. Cool. So thanks for joining me today, Justin. I before we kind of jump into all of the goodness that we were just talking about, I was wondering for anybody who might tune in,
Mhm.
if you could give a little bit of context of like who you are and specifically in a very like social justice way, like name some identities of yours that are probably going to be relevant to this conversation around
Mm.
like allyship identity. Like it's just people can look at you and make assumptions, but it's always better to just name them out there. So I wonder if we could start there.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for that invitation. My name's Justin. I am. I've been sometimes introducing myself as a connection catalyst as of late, which I am liking more and more. My greatest excitement in life is finding points of connection within the self and with others. And so, um, yeah, I currently work at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, and live across the river in Kingston. And the work I do there is community development related and specifically creating a more vibrant, thriving staff community for a bunch of people who serve an awesome campus that is all about awakening the best in the human spirit and helping people to learn and live happier, healthier, fuller lives. Yeah, and so that is some of my 9 to 5 ish, and then intertwined with that is finding ways that we can all just figure out this human thing and get a little bit more, a little less separateness, a little more connection. So that's me. Um, my identities, I check off many of the privileged status box identities, but beyond that, some that I particularly explore is recently, for some time, I've said relatively straight, and more recently, like maybe within the last month, have even been exploring queer as as a possibility. That's one of my journeys, and another identity is a humanist identity, so spiritually focusing on um, human connectivity and not necessarily uh, atheism, but somewhere within the realm of secular spiritualism. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Uh, Thanks for that. What,
Mhm.
so I would love to, so we'll both like have the conversation, and then I also love exploring kind of like having the conversation. What is your thoughts on when people have that norm of like naming identities into a space when you are like entering a conversation around social justice and people
Mhm.
are like, as a white person or as a man, I blank, right? And then they ask or expect that of like groups. What comes up for you in that?
Yeah, what's that feel like? Well, I identify primarily with masculine pronouns, him, his, he. And yeah, in those moments, for me, I find it's like a window. It's like an entry point uh, in two ways. Uh, in one way, it's like this beautiful curiosity of point of seeing like, oh, what are these other humans experiencing in this room? And it's just like it's like, oh, I get to take this in and see. And then also each time I do it, it's a reminder for me to explore that for myself. And it's like another stepping point of like, oh well, that's new. I didn't voice that I was queer in the past, or I haven't said that in a group. The first time I said that to a group was last night. And so like the opportunity given was an opportunity for me to give myself that, to explore that too. So yeah, I've come to really enjoy it. And sometimes it also is uncomfortable because I'm not sure where I'm at in some of the things.
Yeah. One of the things that when we talked about like what this conversation would entail
Yeah.
was about kind of where this stuff all started for you. So I was at an event last night, and which was about interrupting whiteness, and
Mm.
there was mostly people my age or above, or older. But the woman in front of me had like her like 12-year-old daughter with her, and that kid played video games most of the time on the phone, but like she was just there, you know? And I was like, man, that's not a thing that I would have gone to at 12. Like that's not a thing that I would have gone to in maybe even in college, right? Like a purposeful exploration of racism. And some people have those conversations very early and throughout their lives, and some of us have to take a class, right, or have to like start going to workshops or be, you know, stumble into it other ways. So I wonder, like, what comes to mind for you if I said like exploring identity or exploring social justice or diversity stuff? Like, what comes to mind for you as like a starting point or just the beginning?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I wouldn't have been there either as a 12-year-old. Yeah, it's a fascinating. It's like, yeah, what is that story? Yeah, those conversations was not within the language of my family, and not for a lack of closeness to it, just for a lack of that being even on the radar. Um, and so, kind of priming growing up that I received in that, I can recall like a very visible memory and like a point of pride for me when I went to elementary school was looking up. The halls of my elementary school were lined with flags of all the different countries that represented students that were there. And I grew up in a medium-sized college town in Northeast Ohio, and so we had a lot of, you know, diversity of, or at least a decent diversity of ethnicity, cultural, and color, their identities. And I remember maybe not entirely understanding that as a kid, but growing up in a school system and environment where it was like, oh yeah, there's like, I can see things that are different from my own realm of experience, and always being really like intrigued and excited about that, in tandem with also being very hesitant and uncomfortable with exploring that in some ways, just because it was the unsaid in my family and with friends.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what's that?
I was just thinking about like the flags thing. Like that's such a like awesome visual, because I feel like so many of us have had that experience, right? Of like through a college or through high school or middle school, right? Being like, look at all the flags, like look how cool and diverse we are. And there's this some like, because it's for some reason there's this like more flags the better, right? Like if we can just add like one more up there, it's like, oh
Right.
yes, like we're there's some tangible sense of accomplishment with that type of diversity, and and there's some, I don't remember anybody being like, isn't it awesome that we have so many flags? That doesn't need to be said, right? Like that's why you're displaying them, because they're awesome, right? Like
Yeah.
the other thing that comes to mind that schools display are like trophies, right? Or like
Right.
awards that you've won. So like there's some thing there, and like now that makes me kind of uncomfy, because like
Yeah.
it's in the realm of like a display case, right?
It's
And
like
it's not.
trophyizing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I hear you, and I actually hadn't. I haven't engaged with that in this way before. So there was a level of excitement, but then there was also like, and now what do we do with this? Like I remember feeling that in many, you know, instances in my schooling and upbringing was like, yeah, like I know this thing is around me, and we champion this in some way, but what are we doing with it? um,
Do you
or not?
remember do you remember any early like memories of like, ooh, like this is uncomfortable, or like I have very select, but they're you know, etched in there.
You know, it's kind of it's fuzzy, but I remember images of sitting at desks and having moments where I could feel tension and discomfort, particularly around race, in the room, and it going unaddressed. Like the fear and discomfort was unaddressed,
Mm.
right? Like we were just kind of plowing through the lessons with almost like an expectation that, yeah, this is just uncomfortable, and but we're not going to say anything about it. And I can remember moments of being like, I want to say something about the uncomfortableness of this. Like, how do we talk about this discomfort thing? Like, I don't know what to do. It's that paralyzation. I felt paralyzed at points. And it wasn't for me until college, undergrad, when I went to higher education, that I started stepping into those conversations more with people. And there was still a degree of the trophy, ness of diversity, but there was more engagement around what are we actually celebrating? What does that look like? What does that feel like? How are we not meeting the mark? And those conversations started pretty early on as I got engaged with a lot of student affairs realms, things of the whole residence life and other student affairs realms that were more engaged with those conversations, at least at my school.
Yeah. I think about when I started doing social justice work, like education, and I remember, I still say this, which I'm realizing it's just so wildly inaccurate, that most people fear going to like a social justice workshop or a diversity and inclusion lecture or whatever, because they've gone to other ones that have been really like shame-filled or uncomfortable. But like, to me, I've always attributed it to like, oh, other things like this have been uncomfortable for you. Or like you have an expectation of these types of things being spaces where you are just shamed for having a lot of privilege. And what I'm realized, or what I was thinking about in your conversation, is like, no, this probably goes back to grade school for most of us, right? Where we had a 2-day like lesson on slavery, and no one was like, so how problematic was that, right? Like, that was never said. It was just like, oh, and this was a thing, and then it was not a thing. Hooray. Like, and that was the whole, right?
Now we're here.
And now we are not that. Like,
yeah, we're not. Yeah.
We do not own people anymore. Like, that discomfort is like probably part of, especially like white kids in America, that unspoken, right? Like, unspoken discomfort of like, we just don't talk about it, and we don't acknowledge how uncomfortable it is, and we definitely don't explore that discomfort, was actually part of our like process of growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Like, I don't think I've explored that, how far back I think that fear, or just discomfort, right? Just that discomfort and then fear of what do we do with the discomfort goes.
Yeah. I mean, did you experience? So one of my experiences growing up as a white person was this kind of theme of, what do I call a Black person? What do I call a person of color? How do I even say that? With just this sense of like fear and discomfort and paranoia of sorts, like just that. Like, it seems like that is a not universal, but fairly common experience for a lot of white people at any stage of their journey. It's just like that realization of not knowing how to just ask somebody like, oh, how would you prefer to be called? That is an uncomfortable conversation. Like, we're not taught that. I was not taught how to even breach those topics, or handle them.
And it's said in, right. I do think that's something that like I could not tell you. I definitely know the phrase people of color didn't exist in my life until maybe college, till undergrad. There was no, like, I still hear people say, like, instead of saying people of color, they say minorities. And I think that's probably the language that, if we were naming it specifically, like if we were even getting to the point of explicitly acknowledging race, then we probably would have said minorities, not racial minorities, which definitely improves that word, but just like minorities. And then there would have been something, but I even think like there's a vagueness that I'm like now profoundly uncomfortable with, and I think it probably has always been uncomfortable, but just now I know how to identify what the discomfort is. Like, I was at a house concert with that was for old time music, like old folk music. Almost everybody there was like 50, 60, 70 years old. And me and my girlfriend were there, and we were in our 20s. And the band up at the front is like, hey, just to let you know, we changed a few lyrics in the next song because they were, and they struggled for a word, right? And you hear a couple people be like, inappropriate, or like, old fashioned. And I'm like, we all know what they're talking about, right? Like, we all know what they're, and then finally someone next to me just goes, racist. And I was like, amen. Thank you. That's what we were all thinking, but not saying. Right? Yes. Like, we all knew what the thing was. Like, we all knew that it was like, you changed a racist lyric. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate the awareness. But even with the like awareness, right, of like, we don't want to sing racist lyrics, so let's change it. They still couldn't say like racism. Like, that wasn't a thing they were willing to say, or had the practice to say. And it was fascinating. And I was like, man, that kind of embodies to me conversations about race in like the average white, not explicitly racist household. Like, right? Like, if it's, because I think people who are explicitly racist are very good at saying very racist things and acknowledging it's racism, right? Like, that's not the problem, but it's in the like not explicitly racist white households. Like, that's how I think we talk about race, is just by not saying any word that could be definitely that. Which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah. You said not everybody thinking the thing and not saying it, right? That's such the underlying theme in those conversations. Yeah.
Do you remember what, like, the first time you were in a conversation where you were asked to talk about like your experience as a white person?
Yeah. Maybe not the first conversation, but I remember the first memorable moment.
Okay.
Which was in an intercultural communications course. And that was for the first time asked me, it asked all of us to explore our own racial, ethnic, cultural identity. And for me, that was the first time I'd ever thought about my race and my racial identity. And it was, and that interlinked with how my family, like the language of my family, how that was related to it. The dynamic of my family structure, all of that. That was a profound learning moment for me. That recognized, like, oh yeah, that's why our conversations go like that, or that's why we haven't said those things. What? That's okay.
So what I'm hearing is like, is our conversations go like that because we're a white family, or like, am I filling in that blank appropriately?
Part of it's because we're a white family, but also part of it's because, like, oh, this is our experience and this is what we haven't explored as a family as well. And so that's why our conversations are going in such a way that we're not comfortable with going to some of these places, is because we haven't done that exploration. Like, I realized that I was probably the only member of my family that explored, and I should say immediate family, that explored that identity and lens, like looking at experience as a lens in that way ever, And so it really helped. It helped me realize some things about my family way of being and way of communicating. Yeah, as a white family, as a middle class family who hadn't really examined together our experience as those people.
Yeah. I don't know if I can remember. There are like particular moments that like stand out to me. And I think what strikes me when I think back to them is like how much work I thought I had done, or that I had done. Like, how much time I had spent talking about racism or thinking about racism or like exploring what that meant.
Yeah.
And then still when somebody was like, what is your experience as a white person? Like I was like,
Yeah.
like the best answer I had was like, I don't experience racism. Like that's
Mhm.
what I know, you know. And I think that was okay, but it wasn't, I didn't actually know what that meant. I just knew what it didn't mean.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like
Tell me more about that.
so I was like, I could have done a bunch of sentences that were I don't. So like I don't get followed around in a
Mm.
store, right? Like when I'm shopping. Uh
Right.
like or I don't assume I don't like I'm not like super fearful or more fearful than typical uh for when I'm like interacting with a police officer. Or
Hmm.
I don't think that people make assumptions about me based on my race. Like
Yeah.
I I could have said those things, but I couldn't have said like I can walk around in a store and not be followed, right? Or like I can call a police officer and I don't have any fear that they're not going to believe me.
Right.
And um, like there are other identities in which I like experience some hesitation or fear or awkwardness,
Hmm.
but not my racial identity, right? Like that's
Mm.
just whereas like so, but now like I think I would be able to answer that question differently. In that, like, so I like hoodies. Like, I
Hmm.
wear hooded sweatshirts, reasonable amount. Anytime I put up my hood when I'm walking,
Hmm.
I'm just like, this is what white privilege looks like. Like, no one looks at me when I'm wearing a hoodie
Hmm.
with the hood up and goes like, oh no, I should be afraid of that person.
Right. I'm gonna walk to the other side of the street. Yeah.
Right. Or just has this thought of like, why does that person have their hood up? Like, I don't think they have
Yeah.
that thought. Like,
No.
even just that simple a thought, they're just like, but that person's cold, right? Like, there's no there's no questioning of motivations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and like especially if I do it like in a neighborhood I don't live in, or in like in the evening, right? Like I'm just like I'm so aware of the fact that like I don't know if I would feel comfortable doing that if I wasn't like pasty white, right? If I wasn't like painfully obviously white from a distance.
Yeah.
And to me, like that's one of the like tiniest examples of like that's what a white experience is, right? Is like
Yeah.
that's not a thing. You are told like you shouldn't do that. People will make assumptions about you that are unflattering at the least and dangerous at the most, right? Like
Hmm.
uh yeah, because
Hmm.
race, I think when I got asked that question, race was still like race is something other people have or have to deal with, and
Mm.
like I have to deal with that because I know that,
Mm. Mm.
but not because of me. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hearing the sense of having an awareness of racism as it impacts others, but at the time of that conversation, it's been a journey to learn like privilege and how racism is direct, like intrinsic to your own experience.
Yeah, like
Uh,
when I sit in a room full of white people, I still don't know if I walk in and I'm like, damn, this is a lot of white people, right? Like I don't think that I think that I still experience or am more aware of race when a person who I read as a person of color is in the room. And I
yeah,
think that's not true if I wasn't white.
yeah. Thank you for expressing that openly. I appreciate that. I think that's just helpful for us to remind ourselves that
Is
that
that a
happens.
room full of white people is still a room with people with race?
That, but even just being able to say like, there's moments in my life when I don't like recognize race because I don't have to because I'm white, because it's not put in my face, in a
Yeah.
sense. Um, I just hearing other fellow white people acknowledge that, make those acknowledgments, I think are really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like admitting, like, yeah, okay, it's okay to talk. Like, even those of us that are trying really hard, like, we're still there's still so many moments where we're like, oh, and I totally missed that in a moment.
Yeah.
Don't realize so much more to learn. Yeah.
I'm wondering, so something that I'm struggling with a lot is how to invite people into the conversation who
Yeah.
are not actively pursuing it personally.
Yeah.
Um, thoughts?
You mentioned before we, when we had a little chit chat
Mhm.
before we got live, of make going towards an effort of making these conversations accessible. And the same question I had an hour ago and last night through today, and it's just a theme, is like, how do we invite people into these conversations who could really need to be there but don't realize it? Or, I struggle, my own struggles with, like, there's people who need to be there and don't realize it, and also maybe they actually just don't want to be. I don't know if those are the type of people that I'm reaching towards right now. But for the people that need to be there and just aren't aware, because it's not something that they're seeking, what is the compass point that we can move people, that little mark, what's the step that we can move people one step closer towards that? Yeah, I
When,
only have more questions.
yeah. Well, here's a question for you. Like, I think, so you said like who don't realize it. Like,
Mm.
do you think for yourself there was a point in which like where you would say like I really didn't realize I needed to be in those conversations and then that stopped being true? Like when would you say like that's when I realized like ooh I have to do I have to do things something because
Yeah.
I don't know if I yeah like do you
There,
like
no, there was not a flip. You're totally right. There was not a switch flip for me, and it's, yeah, it's like it's still an ongoing journey for me of, like, remembering that my own, that the struggle and injustice of other people, like, is tied directly to my own experience. Um, and like, it's easy for me to kind of tap out sometimes and just be like, oh yeah, I don't have to engage with this right now because I don't feel like I'm forced to.
is there
Um,
is there anything that you think like if that moment hadn't happened I think my journey would have been more winding or like would have been more indirect. Like if I hadn't had that thought or if I hadn't had that experience, that it would have taken me longer to get to where I am.
mm,
Any catalyst moments?
yeah, catalyst moments. That's so it's a good way to think of it. Because it's like those are the moments that we don't, yeah, we never, it's never like completely in the dark to, like, oh, now
Yep.
I'm doing all of this.
Yep.
Um, Slow, continual catalyst moments. I remember one last year where I was working and living at the Omega Institute, and which is an incredible community. Um, but at the time, in a place of that's very much about self-love and self-care, I was feeling really unsettled and frustrated and angry, and I couldn't place it for a while until I realized that it was around a continued series of moments where uh, people of color, high media profile cases of people of color being discriminated or against by the police or brutalized by the police, shot, killed, um, and just the discourse that was happening around it every time was so frustrating to me. And then not engaging with it in a way that I found was, like, healthy or constructive.
What was
Um,
frustrating about it?
it was just like it's just an ongoing cycle. It just keeps happening, and it was just a realization. It was more of just like an awareness of, like, it happens. Oh, it's happening again, and here's the same discourse that is just fostering the wounds, just keeping the issues going. And so for me, the moment was like, of like actually just naming what my frustration and fear was around that, and what I was sitting with, and then choosing then to like what that meant about what I needed to do with that. Like, what was that discomfort telling me? And for me, it was I needed to create some conversations with people on this that are done in a way that I find are more constructive than what I'm hearing or seeing or not seeing and hearing.
Hmm. Do you have any
And
specific examples of like the things that you would hear it and be like, oh, blah, right?
yeah,
Or that you were like, why are we not talking about this? Like, why is this not part of our conversations, or even our awareness about how we're having the conversations?
right, right. Well, it's so often just getting mired in the details of, breaking it down like it was like we were, people were backseat lawyering, um, and we're focusing on the instance and the just the people that were engaged. Like, oh, this police officer was evil or is good, or oh, this person who was shot and killed must have been good or must have been bad, rather than detach, like coming up from that and saying these people were part of the bigger system. These people were part of something that's larger than themselves, and we need to be having a conversation that's larger in scope, while also not detaching our own hand in all of this. Like, I think it's easy. I found so many people, just engaging with those conversations in a way like that was like, oh, well, the police officer must have been that's an evil cop. It's a bad cop, and that like fails to acknowledge that the same motives, the same conditioning that got that person into the place where they were able to choose that is the same stuff that's affecting me in my everyday. Is the same thing that is in some way forming my own little moments of injustices that I may be contributing to. Like, it's just a degree of like detaching from what part of the system we're in. And so that's what I was so frustrated with.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Is there anything that, so thinking about like myself in high school, right?
Hmm.
I think that, well, I think kids in high school are having a much different, like are experiencing a much different conversation around this than I was, in that like they're having one, maybe, who knows? But if I think about, if I had heard people say that stuff in high school, right, I would have been like, that is a bad cop, right? Or like, that is really messed up that this keeps happening. Like, what is it about the police force, right, that allows this to happen? Or what is it about uh, these situations that keep occurring?
Yeah.
But the idea of like, I am somehow personally connected to that thing, which I don't see, like, I don't see myself connected to. Like, do you have anything that someone like said, or anything that comes to mind of like, how did you start making the connection of like, that's not out there, that's
Mm.
like also me, like it's not like, that's a thing that I can very much understand,
Mm.
uh even if I don't want to, like that point of connection or empathy that you or just like seeing that bigger picture that you are included in, like,
Yeah.
how do you make that jump?
How do we make that? Yeah. How do we walk that path? Um, that's such a thank you for that question. When I was thinking about one of the questions you'd asked me is like, how does I was preparing for this, what is my own racial justice, social justice journey? And for ages, I approached it from an academic lens because that's what I was taught through and what I grew up in, which has given me so much, has been such a huge foundation for me. Um, but to be frank, it wasn't until my own journey that I experienced of actually detaching from the academic realm, with my own journey with depression, and of like the journey of being, I need to get into myself and examine vulnerability and fear, um, and sitting with those feelings in a way that is more constructive to my own like thriving, and not even thriving, like just daily survival, like waking up and actually making, getting out of bed. It wasn't until that journey, which has been now like a 3-year journey for me, of like walking more of a path of exploring vulnerability, and these uncomfortable emotions, and how to sit with them and how to use them as indicators in my life. Like that has been a whole reconceptualization of my understanding of social and racial justice. Um, and I'm just coming really more recently back to the realm of like saying like, oh, I'm engaging like really firmly with social and racial justice again. And like it's that empathy point has made a dramatic shift for me. Yeah.
I remember, so I'm going to get to a question.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that you were saying in your story was like, that cop is a bad cop, right? Like that was really a bad situation, and that was a really bad, like evil even, right, cop.
Yeah.
And I remember at some point during grad school being like, I think this whole good people aren't racist, bad people are racist thing is like really troubling. Like that's not a good thing, right? Because then people spend all their time defending themselves that they're not bad people instead of and then I found out later, like, oh no, that's like a thing, like that's like a proven truth.
It happened.
That like that's not just a me thing, right? But I remember being in, so I volunteered and then worked in an office that was for it was the multi-ethnic student affairs office. And I was typically the only white person there. And I remember having a conversation with somebody who was multiracial and being like, I think if we think that racists are bad people, then it's going to be really hard to convince anybody to admit they're racist, right? Like, because then they're admitting they're a bad person, and like nobody wants to be a bad person.
Yeah.
So I was like, so I think if that's true, then we have to be okay with the idea that like you could be a good person and a racist. And they were like, what are you asking me to accept? Like, right, are you asking me to accept like all of this harm that I've experienced, and that good people are doing that? And I was like, no, but I think I should operate from that assumption at least. Like, I'm not necessarily saying like you have to, but I think I think I should, because like otherwise I'm going to spend all my time defending myself as a good person, right? Instead of trying to just be less racist. And I'm wondering, like, do you remember having a realization or an understanding of like, oh, good people can be racist too? Interesting. Because like I definitely, grew up with the understanding of like racists are bad. Right. And if that sentence is true, then your little kid brain goes like, cool. So like not racists are good. And like that's a dichotomy. Like,
so yeah. And it's so easy and natural to do, compartmentalizing our biological mechanisms up here. It's like, oh, lovely, yeah, good, bad, yes, racist, not racist, easy.
Very helpful. Yeah,
I can understand that.
It's easy. It is easy.
The nuance is so much more difficult. I'm trying to think, can I imagine or can I remember one of those moments? I think,
or like, do you agree with that on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's more and more what has fundamentally become the way in which I'm looking to walk, or at least at the moment, the way in which I'm walking my journey of social justice is from a point of like, one of the biggest barriers I see is good people's failure to recognize the fear and uncertainty that they have with regards to race and racism. That will then manifest their reaction, the way they deal with that fear, I too deal with that fear, comes out in ways that is manifesting in harmful ways. Sometimes that I or we are very aware of, like, oh crap, that just happened. Like, I just said something that was like really like not okay. Or in moments that we're not even aware of that we're doing in the pursuit of being a good person, that we're doing harm. There are moments that I have been checked on that. The moments for me that have stood out, like you asked, of like recognizing, wow, somebody could be good and still bad or not good and still bad, good and racist.
Good and racist.
Good and racist. It is like, right. It almost feels like the wrong saying it, but is when I like was really just sitting and asking myself, like, because there were these police shootings of young black men that kept happening, people of color. It was like I had to just eventually. I just sat and was like, I need to try to put myself in the shoes of someone that was there. Can I really believe that someone is just evil? If I was in that person's shoes, having experienced what they did, could I have made the same choice? If I was in their shoes, if I was surrounded by people telling me that because I'm a cop, I am a bad person, or because I'm a cop, I'm, or just instigating more fear and insecurity in myself. If I was in those shoes of feeling othered and insecure and like I'm getting attacked, I know that may be a stretch for. I realize when I say that there's sometimes a stretch for people to be like, oh, really? We can talk. You're gonna say that about a cop? But like, if I can really imagine that, like, yeah. In that moment, would I make a similar decision? Maybe I would. And that's scary for me to say, but it's like felt more and more honest when I keep exploring it. Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I think the idea. So I think that so dehumanization sounds like a really academic-y word, and I'm not a fan of it because of that. But like the idea of seeing someone as only a role, or as only an identity, or as only a group of who they are, right? And and I think it's a lot easier to not do this when you have a personal connection, right? Like I don't know anybody who is a police officer, but if I did, right? Like if I was able to be like, my best friend from high school, their dad is a police officer, and their dad always seemed like a really good guy. Like, so I don't think all police officers are unanimously evil, right? Yeah. And what about if this happened to be like my friend's dad? Like, what would I think then? Like, what cognitive dissonance would that create? And like the reason that it's helpful to be able to relate, like to know different people, is because then you can go like, okay, if that was Justin, right? And in this parallel universe, Justin is a police officer, like, and he made that decision, like, how would I make sense of that? Like, what would I do to make sense of that? And that's, I think when we can't do that, it is easier to dehumanize people, right? Like on both sides, it's easier to dehumanize the cop, and it's easier also to dehumanize the person who they have murdered, in some cases, harassed, whatever, put in jail. Like it's easier to do it on both sides. And but I think the question when it is like, what the heck drives good people to do horrible things? Like right, that's when we can start looking at a way bigger system in question. But yeah, I really think that like the more this is now going in a different direction, but I was really sometimes we think about like all of these systems, right, create us living in really like little siloed, segregated neighborhoods. Right? Like that's how I always thought of it, was like racism equals segregation. And recently I have been really thinking about how it goes the other way too. Like segregation equals racism, because it's so much harder to discriminate against somebody who you're like, that guy reminds me of my neighbor, who
Right.
I like, who is nice, who introduced himself when I moved in and helped me carry my couch, right? Like, if you're able to walk down the street and be like, what's up? You know, like to a couple people who don't look like you every day, that's probably going to make you less afraid when you see people who look like that anywhere else. Because you'll be like, that guy looks like my neighbor. They have the same hat. Like, but I don't, right? Like, I mean, I do right now, but I haven't in the past.
Right.
And same with like segregation by race or segregation by class. Like, I don't know anybody who's a police officer. I don't think that's a good thing. Like, right? Like, because then I'm able to just write all police officers off as like, well, those aren't my people.
Mm.
Instead of having to be like, no, that's my cousin's husband, or that's my like brother's best friend, right?
Mm.
Like the level of separation, right? If segregation scares people, just like separation, right? Just allows it to be so much less personal.
Yeah.
So
It begs such a good question of who are the people we're separate from. Yeah. Like not even, and then we can get to the question like who are we separating ourselves from, but like who are we just like physically separate from,
sure,
right? Because it makes such a difference. Yeah.
yeah, like
I mean, yeah. I saw people in undergrad. One of the biggest challenges I had when I was developing community was one community of people separated by two different buildings. There was an othering right there, full separation of people. You know, of who's in my neighborhood, right? Who are the people I talk with? Who are the people who are in my circles? Makes that such a big difference. Yeah.
and I think that's why college is so incredible. Like college in the US, especially residential colleges, like it is often the first time where people are going to live in a genuinely diverse environment, right? Like all of the kids of color are predominantly coming from largely like neighborhoods where that is the majority of their people, right? Is like people of color, and perhaps even lots of different types of people of color, or it could be like very segregated, right? Up all Latino neighborhood or an all Black neighborhood. And like almost all of the white kids come from almost all white backgrounds. And then all of a sudden we throw them all in the same residence hall and be like, figure it out. Like,
Get along.
and it's
Yeah.
wild. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, that's how it was for me. I came from 95% white places, right? Like me and my siblings could name every Black person in my school on less than two hands. And it was a school of like 1,000 people. Like,
Wow.
I mean, I think it was really like 95 isn't like an estimation. That's like a census data like of my town. And then I went to a school where a good amount of my friends there were women of color, like, or at least some of them were, right, as opposed to 0% before. Even like, yeah, and that's just I don't know. I think we expect a lot of people to be somewhere where they've had no institutional support and also no like personal access without a ton of effort, like to be like I had so no exposure to people of color, right? And white people don't typically talk about race unless there are people of color around. And I just had like what we talk about in school in like a public school education system. And that's like a pretty narrow thing to come in at 18, 19 years old, you know, and not, and no one having told you like, your worldview is very small, you know, like I was born abroad. Like I thought my worldview was humongous, you know, and like that's still so far from the truth. And that was only 8 years ago or like 10 years ago, like,
Mhm.
I don't know. I still have more years of not having any exposure or understanding or
Mhm.
purposeful inclusion of people of color in my life, my literature, my like everyday. Like I have 18 years of that and I have 10 years of like sort of kind of not that.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
guess I don't want to say I'm not surprised that it's hard or like that I'm still learning on such a curve,
Yeah.
or there's so much to learn, but like at the same time, like, gosh, I already feel like I should be so much farther along
Mm.
when I don't know, I'm not.
Yeah. It's just part of the journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I want to wrap up here in a moment,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, like, what are your plans, or like what are the things you're trying to do right now to
Mm.
like not continue walking paths that you don't want to continue walking?
Mm. It's a question I've asked myself within the last week. Like, what am I committing to?
Mm.
Um, um, Plans, more engagement where I work with the community, just with the community I currently exist with, of creating conversation, and inviting people in and listening and asking questions. Um, just within the last day, there were moments that kind of stoked the fire for a lot of people by virtue of some experiences and events that were on campus, that were like really empowering for people. And so I saw this like fueling up. People like, oh, like we can do something. Like there's this energy here, and it's for me, it's like recognizing that that energy is beautiful but can be fleeting,
Mm.
and capturing what I can of it, and like using it to catalyze in this moment. And so there's like 3, 4, 5 people that I've put names down. I've started a list of the people that I think are like ready and ripe, and who are like doing their own journey and work with this, and that I can directly get with them and empower and say, yes, how can you do this? How can we do this? What are we doing next? And so that's been like my process just today, was like writing names down, saying these are the people, these are the solutionizers, as this beautiful climbing poetry um, uh, performers last night, not just performers, but activists and incredible humans, uh, have the word solutionaries. And like, who are those people in my life, and what are we going to do? Like, what am I doing with those people? Um, yeah, and so that's my next steps, because I think it starts just with the relationships that are closest to me. More and more when I get paralyzed, it's because I think like I need to be, like out here, and that means I have to somehow get to these people and places that I'm not that I don't, and that I'm not connected with yet. And how does that look? And then it's just like I'm like so many times having to just take a moment and like breathe and just be like, okay, I'm here, and there are so many points of connection here that are really meaningful and powerful, that are going to actively get me to where I'm aspiring towards, and us to where we're aspiring towards. And so really taking stock of that.
Mm.
Yeah, but it's tough. Um, yeah, it's equal part. I described it, a pairing of equal part emotions of like yearning and frustration and wanting more, and like, I need this. We need to be here. I need to be here. I'm not there yet. And equal parts like, oh, and I'm here, and this is really meaningful here, and this is something powerful. I can move through this in a way that's really awesome. And so it's like finding that balance, using both of them constructively. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for chatting.
Thanks for creating the space.
That's my favorite thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Space
Well, I love you.
creator.
Well, I love you.
Thanks. Okay. I would love to chat again soon. This was really fun.
Mhm.
And I always feel like it's the beginning of so much further exploration.
Every
I
time.
think I think the initial conversations are so hard to dig 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 deep into because like there's a lot of surface we need to touch before we can even like start going down.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I would love to hear in the future conversations, like what are the practices you're finding that is sustaining your journey through this? Uh,
Mm,
what does that look like for you?
yeah. I honestly think there's like just a quickly answer. Like I think we so many of us do, as you said, like interact at initially, especially those of us with higher education backgrounds, like having gone to college or something,
Mhm.
interact with this stuff first through a lens of academic, and
Yeah.
then we are told like get out of your head, you need to like work it with your heart, and
Mhm.
then we like forego anything academic, right, so that we can just be in community spaces or whatnot. But like I gotta tell you, like reading books, non-academic books, right,
Mm.
just like fiction or nonfiction, right? Like I read a collection of young Native American teenagers and their stories. That's it. Like that's all it was, and it was in the young adult section of the library, and it was on a recommended list.
Mm.
And I learned so much from that. Like I was like, oh my god, this is so bad, like so much bad. But with that ability to recognize the bad, like I'm less likely to say messed up things.
Mm.
Like, and I'm less likely to be surprised if someone says the word genocide, right? Like if somebody says like genocide, I'm not going to be like, whoa there, whoa, right? Like, let's not throw that word around.
Carried away. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I would be like, yeah, that's a thing. That's totally a thing that happened in this country. And like,
Mhm.
I wish that wasn't true, but that doesn't make it not true. Like,
Mhm.
you know, there's a lot of, I just think there's so much value in books and in like articles, but like also if you get tired of the like 5 ways to not be a totally racist white person articles, then like just go read a book. Like it doesn't even have to be fiction or nonfiction for it to be useful. Um, and for me, that's one of the things that I think doing that has really helped, because like nobody needs to tell me, I don't have to learn things for the first time. Like
Mm.
I don't have to hear it from a person of color for the first time and go through that process of like, no, because like it's so different than the narratives that we were brought up with, that
Mm.
like disbelief is going to be part of that journey. So like do the disbelief thing by yourself. Like do the disbelief thing in a book where it can have you for 200 pages, right, where you every 10 pages it can give you another way to work through your disbelief. Like
Mm.
yeah, so it's just a quick answer.
Yeah. But I love it. Our thought tangents, journeys are wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm banking the more of that, of more of like, what does it actually look like to be doing from the head to the heart, and how are we handling disbelief? I love those 2 points. Would be wonderful to talk about with you.
great, let's do
Yeah,
it. All right, well, we're gonna sign off. Thanks again, and yeah, we've got starting places for next time.
we do. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, you're awesome, mate. Thanks.